Hello everyone, welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Review Roundup. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the latest and sometimes greatest films coming to a cinema near you. Today we are talking about After the Hunt, directed by Luca Guadagnino, and that is how you say I have been taking Italian on Duolingo for a few years now. A college professor finds herself at a personal and professional crossroads when a star pupil levels an accusation against one of her colleagues, and a dark secret from her own past threatens to come to light. But before we go any further, if you haven't yet, please like this video. It really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way, you'll never miss reviews like this. This is going to be mainly a pseudo-spoiler review, if you can call it that, but we can and will get into full spoilers at the end, so I can read out your comments and questions. To that end, leave comments and questions, right? If you're watching this live, first of all, welcome. Second of all, conversations like this are always more interesting when we can have a dialogue. So as I'm going through my own thoughts, let me know what you think. Unless it's something like super offensive, I will read every comment and question from the live chat. If you're watching this after the fact, we're still super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description so you can kind of jump around at your leisure. And you should definitely subscribe so that way you can join us live next time. Okay, so kind of looking here, starting to look at, like broad strokes macro view here. There's a really compelling premise here, and it naturally, lends itself to intriguing drama. But I think the main critique that I would give, I think everyone is kind of saying what I'm going to kind of say, but I think, I don't know if anyone's really articulated this way. I think the film gets lost in its ambiguity, whether that ambiguity is intentional or otherwise. And I think there's a little bit of both in the film, right? Obviously, if this film was better, there would be way more discourse about it, but I think because most people are kind of like lukewarm about it, there's not as much conversation, but I feel like, the discourse around this could have been even bigger, but I think the main kind of thing that audiences and critics are trying to wrestle with here, or rather ascertain, is what exactly is Guadagnino and screenwriter Nora Garrett trying to say about the Me Too movement and the reckoning and accountability that it brought. Rightfully so, right? And it's unclear, and this is kind of what I was mentioning with that ambiguity. It's not really clear. It's not so much important, the whole death of the author kind of argument here. It's not super important what they think of the Me Too movement, but what is the film? If the film were a person, what is the film's kind of take on or impression on the Me Too movement? Again, it's ambiguous, but if it's coming down at all, the film's posture somewhat dismisses the whole thing, or at least suggests that it's like, a little bit overblown, right? And the film is way more interested in using, trigger warning here, obviously, if you didn't get it from the film, right, the whole plot is built around an assault, right? A sexual assault by a professor, played by Andrew Garfield, against a student, Maggie, played by Ayo Edebiri, right? The film kind of uses that assault, that event, which, great, mercifully we don't see on screen. It kind of is using that as a springboard to explore other things, which feels kind of gross, right? Using a sexual assault as like a means to an end narratively feels kind of weird, right? And furthermore, with Maggie, right, played by Edebiri, the film kind of paints Maggie as, at least on some level, taking advantage of the situation, taking advantage or capitalizing on this thing that has happened to her. Which again feels very icky, right? Because on paper, she's completely right about everything, right? Like, she should report him. She should, tell her story or, whatever. Or if she should or shouldn't isn't really the point. The point is that she gets to make that call, right? And the film, I'm going to talk about the characters in a bit, but the film tries to paint all of these characters as very unlikable, very complicated, and that's all well and good, but when that starts to bleed over into like have we forgotten that she was sexually assaulted, right? Like the film almost critiques her a little too much, and I really don't think it's fair to really give her too much flack here, because people process anything and everything differently, but especially something as traumatic, unexpected, violating as sexual assault, right? So people process things differently, right? It doesn't matter that she, because she's a PhD student, and one of the things is that she potentially plagiarized her dissertation or part of her dissertation. It's okay, that's all well and good, but that doesn't, okay, you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter if she plagiarized her dissertation. She was still assaulted, right? And the film kind of is trying to, the film is really, more concerned, and its characters seem more consumed by grievance politics, right? So, Alma, played by Julia Roberts, the central character here, and others like her, other faculty members, constantly bemoan, these characters are frustrated by and resentful of the current generation's, what they see as the current generation's entitlement, right? But there's a lot of hypocrisy here, because they'll rail against these kids at Yale, because they're at Yale, right? They'll rail against these rich kids having everything handed to them, and it's okay, I agree, but you guys seem to live pretty well, right? Julia Roberts lives in this big house in New Haven. She's a teacher at Yale. She has help, there's a help staff at the house. It's not like they're living paycheck to paycheck, you know what I mean? And there's no indication that they, grew up in abject poverty or something, right? And while, rich kids can be very entitled, using that framing on Maggie trying to, do something constructive, with the thing that happened to her, I feel that's, again, it's a very icky framing. And people like Alma want people to suffer the way that they had to suffer. Otherwise they don't feel like it's fair, right? It reminds me of the whole thing when Joe Biden was going to cancel a bunch of student debt, and people were like, well, I paid all my student loans, or I was smart enough not to go to school because I didn't want to have the financial burden of the loans or whatever. And it's okay, so because you suffered or had to do things, everyone else has to also do those things. We can't ever have a better society. So there's this tension, it doesn't matter that, and I think Maggie even, she writes an op-ed for Rolling Stone about her experience. And she says something about Alma to the effect of, you would expect her that she's a woman in this very male-dominated field. She would be more understanding to the struggles of young women, but if any case, she has kind of morphed herself in order to fit into the patriarchal system, rather than bustling up against the edges, right? And Alma, there's this one part in the film where Alma delivers this tirade, this super resentful tirade against one of her students, who is also a woman of color, but she's Asian, right? Who the student is sincerely and in good faith filtering or trying to approach a philosophical text from a couple hundred years ago. I forget who it is, but through her modern lens, and this is near the maybe 2/3 of the way into the movie. But so a lot has happened, and Alma has gone through a lot professionally and personally, so she really takes offense to this, and she takes out her frustration with the larger situation on this student, talking about oh, there's no safe spaces, I'm not gonna round the edges for you, and blah 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 blah. And why, I just don't understand this whole argument about safe spaces and triggering and why people are so resistant to it. it's not that we need to coddle people, but at the same time, like, why should, because basically Alma tells Maggie, like, you know what? Like, you have every right to, talk about what happened to you, but if you do and you really make this into a big thing, you'll never get hired at, like, any philosophy department at any university, because whether it's not fair, but all the universities are run by older men, and they're going to be concerned that you might overreact to something that they do, right? And it's like a very appeasing philosophy, right? It's Alma has had to compromise values in terms of, like, the practical realities of, like, okay, if I want to achieve this, I have to play ball, right? And Maggie, representing kind of, the younger generation, summarily rejects this, saying, like, why should I have to? And furthermore, why should we as a group, as women, but black women especially, and that's also something that the film kind of clumsily handles, is, like, obviously the racial difference that Alma is a white woman and Maggie is black. But why should we have to play by their rules when the game was made? It's not an immutable law of physics. It's a system that was created, and it can be uncreated or changed, or so it's the film. If the film has anything clear to say, I think that it is the idea that our society, like, not just individual case by cases, but, like, our entire society is essentially a cycle of abuse, right? And it's constituted by these cycles of abuse, right? So, spoiler alert, it's revealed, kind of sprinkled throughout the film, but we really get, like, the full meaty reckoning with it in, like, the last kind of scene before the epilogue. It's revealed that Alma herself was abused when she was a teenager by, like, one of her father's friends. But she, to this day, is convinced that it was okay because she loved him and that she instigated it. Like, the guy didn't really want to at first, but she kept kind of pushing. And she talks about that being, like, the happiest time of her life, and she, like, holds on to mementos of him with, like, some kind of fabric that she smells, and presumably it smells like him. And it's revealed that, she reported it eventually. Well, because he basically was like, we can't do this anymore, and he gets, like, a appropriately aged girlfriend. And she then, reports the sexual assault or rape, so to speak. She then retracts it later, but eventually the sting is too much and the guy kills himself, like, a couple of years later. And she carries a lot of guilt for this, because in her mind, again, she was a willing and active participant in this relationship. In that, it's I think women, and really anybody, right? So I don't want to just pick on women, but, like, ultimately, statistically speaking, women are more likely to experience sexual harassment or abuse or assault or anything like that, right? And I think for people who haven't experienced that, or even especially those who have experienced that, it's easier to believe that it was something that whoever, like, it was something the victim did, right? Something that they chose to do that they could have not done, or they didn't do something that they should have done. Ultimately, that argument exists because subconsciously it makes us feel better. Because if victims are victims by their own choices, then as long as you make the right choices, something like this won't ever happen to you. But as we know, that's just not how it works. You can do everything right. Like, my argument is, like, anyone should be able to walk down a street in broad daylight completely naked and not get sexually assaulted, right? Like, that is not an invitation to get assaulted. But the people will go, well, yeah, but you could have made better choices about going here, going there. People fully dressed at, like, a normal thing in the workplace will get sexually assaulted, right? So it's rarely because of something. Well, I'm going to even go farther. It's never the victim's fault, right? We can't victim blame. And again, and the film's kind of dealing with that, right? Like, Maggie is at least is said to be a mediocre student. We don't really, it's a lot of tell not show with this movie. That she's like mediocre, at least when it comes to PhD philosophy candidates at Yale, which I guess if you're like the worst PhD candidate at Yale, you're still really good, right? But, she's mediocre compared to her peers. She potentially plagiarized her dissertation. So what, right? That is irrelevant to the sexual assault, right? So Alma is carrying this baggage and guilt. The guilt that this man eventually killed himself. But is completely, I don't even want to put a value judgment on it, but for lack of a better word, delusional, right? That this is the happiest time of her life. I think this is all a construction. It doesn't matter if you were willing. And then her husband, who's a psychiatrist, who she's telling this to, even says, like, it doesn't matter because, not just legally, but ethically and morally, it doesn't matter if the child wants it. The same way if a child wants to eat, ice cream for dinner every night, it's your job as the adult to, not let them do something that's going to put them in harm's way, especially when it comes to something like this. So, it doesn't matter if Alma was willing. And not only willing, but like was the one who instigated it. It's the job of the adult to protect her from herself and from him, right? But that carries over, right? And there's a possibly inappropriate relationship between her and Hank, right? Played by Andrew Garfield. It's they don't say this in the film, but like obviously the actors are not in the same generation, right? Like I think Andrew Garfield was born like in 83, and then Julia Roberts was born in 67 or 68, right? So they're like 16 years apart. But again, they never addressed this, and they're always said that to be like we're just really good friends, presumably for years. So I'm like, well, is Julia Roberts supposed to be playing younger, or is Andrew Garfield supposed to be playing older? Or I would like to think that there's also a diegetic age gap. And we do find out that at one point they did have some kind of affair. Now, and while not an underage situation, presumably he was over 18. If they had an affair, that would still be strange given the age gap and potentially power dynamics. So you see how this thing that happened to Alma when she's 16 is now carrying over and creating new cycles, right? And because of this experience that Alma's had, she struggles to sympathize with Maggie. And there's this epilogue a couple years down the road, like 5 years later. And it shows that Maggie is now engaged to someone who's also like in her 40s or 50s. And again, it shows like another weird, and I don't want to say weird because it's obviously if you're all adults, it's fine. And it's really case by case. But I'm just saying that on some kind of level, there can be, depending on who the two individuals are, there can be like a weird power imbalance. So again, it's just these cycles that just keep happening and happening. And these are all really compelling ideas. But the problem is the film just gets in its own way, right? It just struggles to build any kind of cohesion. Especially when it comes to like building consistent tension, right? The pacing is a bit meandering. It's not helped by a lot of tell not show. And the opening used like this kind of ticking sound effect thing to kind of build some suspense or tension. Obviously you can't do that for the whole film, but the film as a whole never is really able to maintain or recapture a level of anxiety or impending doom that like the opening seemed to suggest, right? But so looking at the characters specifically, I kind of mentioned this earlier. Guadagnino and Garrett paint a picture of a world where no one is likable, right? There are no perfect victims or perfect villains, right? There's just only self-interested people who, if they do the right thing, they only do it because they stand to benefit from it, right? And this, I don't even want to call it moral ambiguity, but just moral complexity, I think is the point, right? That, that the moral clarity that the Me Too movement, projects doesn't necessarily map neatly onto real people. This isn't really to discredit the Me Too movement at all. But what I think this speaks to is the fact that, we have certain images of the villain and the victim, and to do that, the issue is not like, oh, you're making it harder for guys to blah 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 blah. That's not the issue. The issue is actually that it might actually hurt victims by painting assaulters as one-dimensionally evil people. Not because they deserve more credit, but rather because if all we ever talk about are these one-dimensionally evil people, then when you get assaulted by someone who's three-dimensional, you really struggle trying to with the cognitive dissonance of trying to put two and two together. So, in this case, assaulters like Hank can also be smart and interesting, though very pretentious, right? But you know what I mean? Like there's redeeming qualities there. And by contrast, victims can be selfish and mediocre in their professional ambitions and, maybe make the wrong decisions. I'm not even really sure Maggie made any wrong decisions in this movie, but, the victims can make bad decisions following their assault, right? And to say this isn't to diminish the validity of Me Too, but rather it's to bring a further reckoning so that we can then recognize these patterns in people in our real life, and obviously people in our lives are three-dimensional. Speaking of victims, right? Again, Maggie here, Ayo Edebiri. I hope I'm saying her last name right. She turns in a solid performance as Maggie, but it's really hard to tell what to make of it. She's not like a super she's not not likable, but she's not a super likable character. And I can't tell if it's intentional or not that we're not really supposed to like her. And if it's not intentional, I can't quite tell if it's the script or her performance. And maybe it's a combination of all of the above, right? And her characterization, right, really muddies the water. And it's not that we can't have complicated characters in a complicated movie, but it just feels like if you care about the Me Too movement, you wouldn't make a film like this, right? I think that's the thing. It's not that this movie can't exist, but I think it existing the way it does reflects some kind of, again, posture towards or reflexive instinct about the Me Too movement. And again, this characterization is a huge component of why the film doesn't really succeed completely. But I think the biggest reason for that the film struggles is the character Alma, right, played by Julia Roberts. Roberts is always really good, but it was definitely interesting to see her in such a despicable role. I can't say I'm a student of her filmography, so I haven't seen the entirety of it, but this felt like she was playing a little against type, right? Obviously she was the rom-com it girl for years, and then kind of, in more recent years is a very steady hand, down to earth kind of performer. So this is again an interesting change of pace for her, right? But unfortunately, she does the best she can with the material that she's been given, but ultimately the character fails as a protagonist, because her arc is undefined. Or furthermore, there really isn't. I don't even really know what her arc is. And it's not that characters always have to change, right? But the key is that, if you just have a movie with a character and they're just going about their life and they don't change, it's not very interesting, right? We need to see the opportunity for epiphany or change, right? That we need to see, right? Not just be told, but really get a sense that something has happened within the narrative that has forced Alma to confront her flaw, right? This is just basic fundamental storytelling. Or at least confront this thing about her. But we never really get that moment. At least in a narrative sense, we obviously get moments where she's confronted, but we never quite get the sense that she, on some level, is whoa. She recognizes something that, or understands something she hasn't up to this point. And then there's no culminating critical choice, right? If there's no opportunity to change, then there's no moment of change. So, and this is by contrast to something like A Greek Tragedy, where, the whole point is that they don't change, but throughout the story, they are given chances to, and they choose not to change, or they are incapable of changing, or they decide to change, but it's too late, or whatever it might be, right? And we don't really have anything like that here. And it is frustrating. But by contrast, the standout of this movie was Andrew Garfield, right? Again, as this verbose philosophy professor who assaults Maggie. Andrew Garfield, it always helps if Andrew Garfield is playing the role, because he's just like, so he's like one of my favorite actors. But he does a really stellar job here of capturing like the exact kind of person who would be canceled and be in this kind of situation. Someone who's, very smug, rationalizing, manipulative, and in a lot of ways, he's a more interesting character. But that's not to say, like, I think the movie should have focused on him, but, he clearly is going through such lengths to prove his innocence. And then, like, in the same conversation, he, like, tries to essentially force himself onto Alma. And, like, literally 5 seconds after he was like, I did not do it. Do you really believe I would do that? Blah, blah, blah. And then, like, literally tries to do the same thing, right? And that is interesting because, again, this is a kid that... I don't want to call him a tragic character, because that feels like I'm putting a positive value judgment, because it's like, good, you should go down in flames. But, there's this element, it's just a very compelling character created. I just wish that then Alma, as our centerpiece, was a little bit more, was I don't want to say she's not developed, because we know a lot about her, and we see her personality and things like that, but I just feel like narratively, she doesn't really get an arc, or she doesn't really get anything to do. It's just really a lot of her kind of being showcased, rather than her moving through the narrative as like an active participant. But these are all really great actors, and there's more, right, among the cast list. But again, the issue is that they're forced to navigate these melodramatic scenarios and stilted dialogue. And sometimes the dialogue is stilted, diegetically, right? Like the characters are intentionally, well, maybe not intentionally, but like it's for a reason, but maybe it's subliminal or subconscious. They're using dispassionate, almost like analytical, philosophical language as a means of creating a buffer between them and their emotions and their trauma. So that kind of works sometimes, but most of the time, I think it's just non-diegetically stilted and unnatural, right? I don't know if because the entire movie they talk so strangely. I just don't know if that's the intention. It's the intention that they talk that way, but I don't know if it's the intention that it sounds bad, or it's like sounds like bad dialogue, right? But again, it's the film. The film's shortcomings are a shame, because Guadagnino, as we know, he's a highly competent director. His most, actually, I guess it wasn't his most recent film. He's also a very prolific director. But at least his film from last year, Challengers, was one of like the best films of the year, by far. And this film does have some visual choices that that keeps things interesting, but there's nothing here that saves the film. Or I don't even want to say saves, because this is not like a dumpster fire of a movie by any stretch, but it's none of these formal elements, his direction, the performances, a score from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who also just did Tron Ares as Nine Inch Nails. Who would have thought that between these two movies, a Tron sequel and a Luca Guadagnino movie, that are both scored by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, that the Tron movie would be better, or at least I enjoyed that more, right? That's crazy. But like his direction, the score, these performances, they do a lot of heavy lifting to make the film bearable. I could see this script being produced cheaply by like Netflix with like a no-name director, no-name actors, and it just be really, become really, really tedious and just bad, right? But again, so these definitely elevate the film, but these formal elements. But I just don't think they do enough to really help in any meaningful way, right? So now it's time for Q&A. It looks like no one has said anything. No one has any questions or comments about this movie. Again, if you're watching this live or you're watching live in the future, put stuff in there. I'll read out everything, as long as you're not saying something super racist or something. And again, this is always it's always way more interesting when we can have a conversation. as opposed to me just kind of speaking into the void, there is a use to having, hearing other people's perspectives, because you might make me think of something I hadn't thought of before, right? So kind of wrapping things up here, I think there's all the pieces of a really, really good movie here. It just needed, I don't even want to say another draft, because I think there's something fundamental here that you would have to go back to the drawing board and kind of work out. The main thing I think being is having a better handle or understanding on what the film is trying to say about these things. I saw like a Letterboxd review saying like the point of the movie is that it has nothing to say because, people in our day and age, are very performative when it comes to things like this. So they everyone always has to have like their hot take or whatever, but deep down really no one really has any, values or whatever, which I also just fundamentally reject. Or rather that people can have values. They just, a lot of people choose not to, but that's not the same thing as people just all people fundamentally just have no values. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot that could have been done here to improve this, but I think it was I don't know what to call it, a swing and a miss, a swing and a really standard hit on the ball, and then the guy catches it right away, but you hit it and it went far, but it didn't really go far enough, right? So I think I'm going to give this film a 6 out of 10. Again, I think it's a net positive. I think there's enough there to at least get you thinking, right? Even if that's not really a strength of the movie, but rather it's just bringing up ideas that are interesting, and then you can go off and think about them later. But yeah, I think it's a net positive, but it's just okay. And if I never see this again, I think I will survive. But with that, that's it for this installment of Review Roundup. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like this video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And, since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way, you'll never miss a video. And don't forget to comment below and let me know what you think of After the Hunt. Until next time, peace out.